Today we go back to England in the 1920s to look at the case of Herbert Rouse Armstrong, an English gentleman, war veteran and solicitor. Herbert Rouse Armstrong was born in 1870 at Newton Abbot in Devon. He did not come from a wealthy background but obtained a good education and went to Cambridge University. He graduated in law and became a solicitor in 1895. His first position was in his hometown of Newton Abbot. Later he moved to Liverpool. Then in 1906, Herbert took up a position in a town called Hay. Here he put some of his savings into a partnership, and when the oldest of the partners died, he succeeded to the practice. Being a partner certainly improved Herbert's finances so much so that he married a friend from his Newton Abbot days. They moved into a house into the valley of Cussop Dingle. The stream of this valley formed part of the border between England and Wales. They had 3 children in as many years before moving into a larger house in 1910, which was also located in Cussop Dingle. Herbert loved his garden and was obsessed with eradicating garden weeds. After he read about how to eradicate dandelions, it became a particular practice of his to put small portions of arsenic into individual, which he then squirted into the ground near the dandelions, which eradicated them. Herbert worked from a rather plain business premises in Broad Street, Hay, which was part of a shop. The remaining portion was occupied by a firm of estate agents. Across the street were the offices of Mr. Griffiths, who was a solicitor. Mr. Griffiths was Welsh and a local man, was considered a stranger to the small conservative town. However, his business was doing reasonably well. With the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, Herbert, who had previously been a member of the Territorial Army, was called up to the rank of captain, and he was later promoted to major. After a short posting to France, he returned to the UK, which enabled him to again look after his practice in Hay. As the business grew, the business of his rival, Mr. Griffiths, was becoming less successful. So Herbert saw an opportunity to expand his business and offered to amalgamate the 2 practices. Mr. Griffiths, however, had other ideas, and in early 1919 took a partner named Mr. Oswald Norman Martin. This person is important to the story, so remember. Oswald Martin. At the end of 1920, Mr. Griffiths died, leaving Oswald Martin a sole partner in the practice. Herbert was just over 5 feet tall and only weighed 7 stone, which is about 98 pounds or 45 kilograms. He was dominated by his wife. Although she was a devoted wife and mother, she treated her husband and children with a strictness which denied them many harmless activities. For example, Herbert was only allowed to smoke in one room and never outdoors. He was not allowed to drink alcohol. During the period May 1920 and February 1921, a series of highly significant events occurred. Herbert was in London and he met with a lady he had previously met in 1915 while he was in the army. He had previously drawn up a new will for his wife, or at least a will in her name, in which she left everything to him with no provision for their children. During August 1920, Mrs. Armstrong's physical and mental health deteriorated to such an extent that she was admitted to the Barnwood Asylum in Gloucester. Her husband Herbert, she was discharged from the asylum and returned home on the 22nd of January. It was during January 1921 that Herbert made another purchase of £1/4 pound of arsenic. On the 11th of January 1921, he made what was to be his last purchase of arsenic. Now this is very important. He made the purchase at a chemist shop which was owned by his rival solicitor, Mr. Martin's prospective father-in-law, named Mr. Davis. 1 month after, Mrs. Armstrong returned home. She died. It was February the 22nd, 1921. Her doctor, Dr. Hinks, certified her cause of death to have been heart disease. 3 days later, Mrs. Armstrong was buried in the church at Cussop. After Mrs. Armstrong's death, life at Mayfield went on very much as it was before, but Herbert was now master of his own home. He still had a housekeeper and a maid. His youngest child was at home and he had the companionship of school friends during the school holidays. Herbert's practice had continued to develop. He was now clerk of the Justice of Hay, Breadward Line and Payne Castle. And in addition to these posts, he was hopeful of being appointed to a similar position with the bench at Talgarth. The only business worry was Mr. Martin, who was pressing Herbert to complete the long overdue formalities arising out of the sale of a property in which there was a matter of £500 paid to Herbert as a deposit. Around the time that he was pressing for the completion of the property, Mr. Martin was anonymously sent a box of chocolates to his home. Mr. Martin ate some of the chocolates. They were later produced at a dinner party held by Mr. and Mrs. Martin. One of the guests was taken ill, and after examination it was discovered that arsenic had been inserted through holes pierced in the base of the sweets. Later, these holes were found to correspond with the nozzle of the weed eradicator used by Herbert. Suddenly, professional relations between Martin and Herbert improved, as the closing of the building sales seemed to be drawing to a close. On the 26th of October, 1921, Herbert invited Martin to visit his house for afternoon tea. During tea, Herbert passed Martin a scone, apologizing for using his fingers. The contracts and the £500 were not discussed, although Martin could have raised the subject. Later that evening, after returning home, Martin became ill. Who had treated Mrs. Armstrong called at the Martins' house early the next morning. He found Martin in bed with a severe bilious attack and a very rapid pulse. Dr. Hinks made daily calls to examine Martin, who was slowly improving. But he still had a high pulse rate on the 31st of October, 1921. Dr. Hinks sent a sample of Martin's urine to the Clinical Research Association for analysis. A week later, when Martin had recovered sufficiently to return to work, the results arrived with Dr. Hinks. The report stated that the urine sample contained 1/33 of a grain of arsenic. Dr. Hinks knew that none of the medicines prescribed by him for Martin contained arsenic. He had questioned Martin about the food he had consumed immediately before his illness started. He knew that Martin had eaten lunch on the 26th of October, 1921, which had been shared by Mrs. Martin and their maid. Both these ladies were fine and had suffered no ill effects. Dr. Hinks was struck by the similarities between Martin's illness and the illness suffered by Mrs. Armstrong in the period leading up to her admission to Barnwood Asylum. Dr. Hinks' suspicions were raised when he contacted the asylum, and doctors there confirmed they may have also been misled as to Mrs. Armstrong's physical ailments. Dr. Hinks then forwarded his concerns to the Home Office in London. Dr. Hinks kept his concerns to himself, although he did warn Martin. The authorities eventually decided to take action on Dr. Hinks' suspicions. But the investigations had to be conducted carefully. If Herbert was guilty, they could not afford to alarm him. If he was innocent, then they could not afford to cause unnecessary scandal. The investigating police officers, led by Chief Detective Inspector Crutchett, went to Hay after dark and made discreet calls on Mr. and Mrs. Martin, Dr. Hinks, and Mr. Davis being the chemist and Martin's father-in-law. During the period from Martin's return to work until Christmas 1921, Herbert made numerous attempts to invite both Martin and his wife to visit him for tea. Martin, who was aware of the police investigations, repeatedly declined the invitations. 1922, Mrs. Armstrong was exhumed and the pathologist Bernard Spilsbury removed some samples before she was reburied. The samples were examined and found to contain 3.5 grains of arsenic. On the 19th of January, 1922, Herbert Armstrong was charged with the murder of his wife. His trial was at Hereford, and the judge was Mr. Justice Darling, who had a reputation of being a hanging judge. During the 10-day trial, which started in April 1922, Herbert was kept in Gloucester Prison. Every day of the trial he was taken to court. On the first day, the 3rd of April, 1922, a legal debate took place, with the trial jury removed. The legal argument concerned the omission of evidence regarding the poisoning of Martin. Although Armstrong had been charged with poisoning Martin, the case had gone no further. Mr. Justice Darling ruled that evidence regarding the Martin case could be omitted. He later stated in his summing up that the defendant had arsenic in his possession and that he would use it to poison a human being. During the trial, the defense claimed that Mrs. Armstrong had been suicidal and that she had finally committed suicide by swallowing the arsenic which she found that her husband had purchased to kill the garden weeds. This was countered by the prosecution, showing that Mrs. Armstrong was not capable of leaving her bed in the week before her death and that she had said to her nurse on the morning of the day she died, "I'm not going to die, am I? Because I have everything to live for. My children. And my husband." The lady who first met Herbert in Christchurch and later in London 3 months after Mrs. Armstrong's death testified to the prosecution that Herbert had spoken to her about marriage. Bernard Spilsbury testified that the amount of arsenic in Mrs. Armstrong's body could only have occurred through poisoning. Mrs. Armstrong's own doctor, Dr. Hinks, testified that she could have any medicine herself on the day of her death. It was to be expected that a well-educated and professional man like Herbert Armstrong, who was also worshipful master of the Hay Lodge of Freemasons and a churchwarden who read the lessons on Sunday, would testify in his own defense. After completing his testimony and cross-examination, Herbert was about to leave the witness box when the judge asked him to wait, as he had some questions to put to him. The judge's questions exposed the inaccuracies of Herbert's earlier replies. It was presented in the earlier prosecution evidence that he had made up some 20 small bags of arsenic as he stated to put into individual dandelion holes to kill these weeds. Now, the judge asked why he had done that when it would have been easier to pour from the original packet into holes in the ground. Armstrong replied, "I really do not know. At the time it seemed the most convenient way of doing it." The judge continued by asking why Armstrong, who was a solicitor by profession, why did he not tell the police earlier about the 2 packets found in his desk at home? The questions continued to be asked by the judge, and Herbert was showing more signs of floundering as the judge's questions continued. After the prosecution and defense had been completed, the judge summed up the case for the 12-man jury, which was composed of 8 farmers, a fruit grower, and 3 professional gentlemen. The judge stated that the possession of the 2 bags of arsenic in Herbert's desk showed just possession of arsenic and nothing else. The main point was the state of Mrs. Armstrong in her last few days before her death at her home. Mr. Justice Darling also reminded the jury that if it was wrong for him to have allowed the evidence of Martin's poisoning, then this was a matter for the Court of Criminal Appeal should Armstrong be found guilty. Armstrong was found guilty of murdering his wife and sentenced to death by hanging. On the 31st of May, 1922, at the age of 53, Major Herbert Armstrong was hanged in his best tweed suit, the only English solicitor to go to the gallows. 70 years later, however, doubts over his guilt started to surface. There were suggestions that Mrs. Armstrong may have dosed herself accidentally with her husband's arsenic. The chemist Herbert bought it from was Oswald Martin's father-in-law, and he had a double grudge against Major Armstrong. Not only had Major Armstrong helped a rival chemist set up a practice in Hay, he also posed a threat to his son-in-law, who wanted a monopoly on the Hay legal affairs. We will probably never know if Major Herbert Armstrong was truly guilty or if he suffered a gross carriage of misjustice. Today we are in Cyprus and in Britain for a case that is little known and received only a small amount of press coverage back in the 1950s. So sit back and let's open the case file. Stella Christofi was born in the beautiful Mediterranean island of Cyprus in 1900. Her family were very poor and she did not receive much of an education. She was illiterate, and at the age of 14 she married and later gave birth to a son, the couple called Stavros. Her relationship with her mother-in-law was bad. With 2 other women in 1925, when she was 25 years old, she was put on trial in Cyprus for killing her own mother-in-law with the help of 2 other women. The way Christofi murdered her mother-in-law was quite brutal. She shoved a burning piece of wood down her throat. At the trial in Cyprus, however, the 3 women covered for each other, and Christofi was acquitted for lack of evidence. Her husband, however, left her after the trial. So now she was homeless and very poor and left to bring up her son Stavros alone. She did, however, bring him up well, and Stavros grew up and got a job as a waiter in the country's capital, Nicosia. Stavros was a very good worker, and in 1941 he secured work in London, England as a waiter in Café de Paris, which was a very popular venue in the city. While working there, he met Hellerglecher, who was a German, and worked in the sales department of a clothing store close to Café de Paris. They went out and eventually got married. The couple were happy and worked hard to improve their prospects, and after a while managed to move to the very nice area of Hampstead in London. They had 3 children and life was good, especially for Stavros, who had worked hard, learned English, and was liked by everyone who knew him. In July 1953, Stavros' mother decided to visit the family in London. She hadn't seen her son for 12 years. At first, the family welcomed Christophe into their home. But as time went on, things started to deteriorate. Christofi blamed her daughter-in-law for everything. She didn't like the way Hella had decorated the house. She didn't like the way Hella brought up the children. And the fact that Stavros was happy living in London and did not want to go back to Cyprus really bothered Christofi. Christofi had been living in London with her son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren for 12 months. And Hella had pretty much had enough of her mother-in-law. She had enough of the criticism. She told Stavros she was going to take the children to Germany for a visit, and when she came back, she expected her mother-in-law to have gone back to Cyprus. Christophe, however, liked living in London, and she had no intention of going back to her Mediterranean homeland. On Wednesday, July 28, 1954, Stavros left for work. He said goodbye to his wife, and then he said goodbye to his mother, who was in the living room. Hella had just put the children to bed, and she was about to have a shower. Christofi heard the bathroom door close. So she went to the kitchen and took out the heavy metal tray from under the wooden stove. She crept upstairs and quietly opened the bathroom door. She saw Heller. Heller turned her head as the bathroom door opened. And with one hard blow, Christophe hit her daughter-in-law in the head with the tray. Heller fell to the floor but was still alive. Christophe then dragged the unconscious body to the kitchen where she strangled her until she was dead, by using a scarf. According to the forensic report, she did this with so much force that the scarf had penetrated Heller's skin. Christophe now had to cover her tracks, so she took off her son's wife's wedding ring and hid it in her bedroom. She then dragged the dead body out to the garden where, in an attempt to destroy the evidence, she put paraffin soaked round it and set it on fire. At the time, a neighbor, John Young, who was letting his dog out, noticed the fire in the back garden and could see what appeared to him to be a tailor's dummy being burnt. It was now 1 o'clock on Thursday morning. Christophe then ran into the street and raised the alarm by stopping a passing car. She shouted in her very limited English, "Fire burning, children sleeping." The fire brigade arrived and put out the fire. They rescued the children who were still asleep and discovered the partly charred body of a woman in the garden. They were able to notice a red mark around the neck. Christophe had planned that the body would be too badly burnt to reveal anything. The police were then called and a search of the house revealed Heller's wedding ring, wrapped in a piece of paper in Christophe's room. When questioned, she told officers that she had been asleep and had been awakened by the sound of 2 male voices downstairs. She went downstairs and had seen one man in the garden before she went to Heller's bedroom where there was no reply. She said she kept knocking on the door. She then saw the body on fire in the garden, so went for some water to try and put it out. Police did not buy her account of what happened and immediately arrested her. She was remanded in custody, and after the post-mortem she was charged with murder. Christophe's son Stavros and her lawyers advised her to plead insanity, but she refused, saying, "I'm a poor woman of no education, but I'm not a mad woman." Dr. T. Christie, the principal medical officer at Holloway Prison, examined her and stated, but after observation of the prisoner since the 30th of July, 1954, he had formed the conclusion that she was insane, but was medically fit to plead and stand trial. He found her to be suffering from a delusional disorder that made her fear that her grandchildren would not be brought up properly by Heller and that she would in time be excluded from seeing them due to the clash of cultures between the two women. This seems a reasonable conclusion, but did it make her insane? 1954 and lasted for several weeks. Despite the overwhelming evidence that included blood and paraffin on her own shoes, she kept protesting her innocence. The prosecution portrayed her as ungrateful, callous, and domineering. A woman who attacked an attractive young defenseless mother in the most gruesome manner, attacking a woman who had shown her nothing but hospitality and home. At the end of proceedings, the jury of 10 men and 2 women took just under 2 hours to find Christophe guilty. She was sentenced to death by hanging. Christophe showed no emotion when the verdict was read out. However, under the provisions of Criminal Lunatics Act of 1884, the Home Secretary had the duty to have a condemned prisoner examined by prison psychiatrists to see if there was concern over their sanity. The psychiatrist reported that the prisoner was not in their view insane and that in their view she did not suffer from any minor mental abnormality which would justify them in making any recommendation for the reprieve of the sentence on medical grounds. On the 12th of December, it was announced that there would be no reprieve and the execution would be carried out on Wednesday the 15th of December. There was then a debate among British MPs on how that was possible. According to various accounts, 6 Labour members of Parliament questioned the death penalty in her case. One noted, "The mere fact she did not claim insanity shows she is not of sound mind." Christophe was the last foreign woman and the second to last female ever hanged in Britain. There was very little press interest in her execution. Some say this was because she was middle-aged, unattractive, and foreign. On the 13th of December 1954, 29 years after she had murdered her mother-in-law in Cyprus, Christophe was executed by hanging in Holloway Prison for murdering her daughter-in-law. Well, today we are going back to France for another true case, and I emphasize the word true as you would all be forgiven in thinking, but from start to finish this is the work of fiction. I assure you it's all true, so sit back as we go back to 1950s France. Yvonne Chevalier was born in 1911 in France. She was from a poor family. She lived on a farm near the city of Orleans, which is about 75 miles south of Paris. Yvonne did well at school and became a midwife at the local hospital. Colleagues in the hospital described her as shy. And when she was 24 years old, she met 26-year-old Pierre Chevalier, a medical student. He was confident and from an eminent Orleans family. They were instantly attracted to each other despite their social differences. Yvonne moved into Pierre's apartment just weeks after they met. From the start, the relationship was intense both physically and emotionally. Although Pierre was a very on the continent. In 1939, the Second World War began, and in 1940, the German army invaded France and quickly occupied most of the country. Orleans was only the 10th largest city in France, but it became a tactical target because of the Loire River, which was considered a line of demarcation. The German forces relentlessly bombed Orleans, destroying many of its historic treasures, including a museum dedicated to its hometown hero. Joan of Arc. France surrendered on June 22, 1940. A German military force occupied 3/5 of the country, including Paris and Orleans. When the war started, Yvonne had just given birth to their first son, Matteo, and Pierre was in his final months of medical training. Before finishing his medical studies, however, he made a brave decision to join the Free French movement of just 7,000 Frenchmen, and soon he became a leading figure of the resistance in Orleans. With recruitment and momentum, the movement grew over the next 4 years of occupation. Some, like Pierre, participated in sales of resistance fighters who managed to pull off great acts of sabotage against the German occupiers. By D-Day in 1944, the Free French movement had grown to 400,000 people. Orleans was bombed by the Allies that summer as they tried to cut off river crossings from the retreating Germans. When Allied soldiers arrived in the city on August 16, 1944, 10 weeks after D-Day, the Allies liberated Orleans and they discovered that the city had a thriving shadow government led by Pierre and a handful of others. For his bravery, Pierre Chevalier received the French. He was elected mayor of Orléans, and in 1945, Yvonne gave birth to the couple's second son, Tougal. Despite his career in medicine, Pierre had always wanted to go into politics and spent more and more time in Paris, while Yvonne was left behind in Orleans to care for their children. In 1950, he was elected to the National Assembly, which meant even more time would be needed in Paris. So he took an apartment there and frequently stayed overnight. Like any politician, he maintained a busy schedule of appearances at political and social functions to which his wife rarely accompanied him. Pierre was described as handsome, dashing, and socially adept. Yvonne, on the other hand, was described as dull, witless, and socially not acceptable in French high society. Pierre was spending more and more time away from the family, and Yvonne, who still very much loved her husband, realized that unfortunately her feelings were not being reciprocated. Yvonne decided to change her image in an attempt to win back her husband's love. She read about art, literature, and politics. She frequented fashionable beauty salons and bought more flattering clothes. But none of this worked, and she eventually turned to drugs and alcohol to provide the comfort that was denied to her by Pierre, who had made it pretty clear that he had lost all interest in intimacy with his wife. The couple's lives just went on. Then, in the spring of 1951, Yvonne received an anonymous letter suggesting her husband was having an affair. She was shocked and angry and immediately went and searched his closets for evidence. She didn't have to look very hard and found a love letter in the pocket of one of his suits. It read, "Would have no beauty or meaning for me." The letter was signed General. She knew who Jen was. She was her neighbor, Jen Perrault. Beautiful, intelligent, well-educated, and ultra-sophisticated. She was married and 15 years younger than her rich husband, named Leon. Maybe the sort of woman Pierre should have married in the first place. And Pierre. Jean Perrault and her husband seemed a total mismatch. He was middle-aged, bald, short, and rotund, the owner of one of Orleans' most prestigious and profitable department stores. He worked long hours, meaning he often stayed away during the week. The couples would meet at social events, which would always seem to draw Pierre back home from Paris. The city's gossips loved to talk about Jean Perrault. There were rumors about her romantic affairs and lovers within the Loire region. In the meantime, Yvonne had grown increasingly anxious about her own relationship with her husband. She had nervous tension but led to doctors prescribing her prescription drugs. She became addicted to Maxiton, which is an amphetamine, and Verona. She was chain-smoking and drinking excessive amounts of coffee. Her sleep became sporadic and she developed hooded eyes. The French rules of marital manners demands discretion if not fidelity. Yvonne made inquiries and learned that the affair was an open secret in Paris and Orleans. So Yvonne decided to confront her husband. She left the children in care of the maid and boarded a train bound for Paris. But she returned home utterly humiliated. She was turned away from the National Assembly by an usher who was under strict orders not to allow her admittance, and Pierre refused to meet with her. Yvonne returned home and went to confront her husband's lover. The women argued about various moral and marital issues, and the confrontation ended badly with screaming and shouting. Yvonne next paid a visit to Jean's husband, Lyon. He told Yvonne that he knew about the affair and would just let it run its course. All Yvonne could think about was the affair, and it was constantly eating away at her. Pierre eventually returned to Orleans to face his wife, but refused to discuss the affair with her, claiming it was a private matter, and continued to treat her with contempt. The same week, he had been nominated to a cabinet position as government minister for education, youth, and athletics. Pierre believed that a divorce would end his political career, as France was a Catholic nation but tolerated affairs but not a divorce minister. Yvonne decided to take the boys to the coast for a week's holiday, hoping the time and distance apart from his children would bring Pierre back to his family. But when she returned, nothing had changed. Yvonne was very distressed. Here she was, a mother and a wife, trying to bring up 2 children pretty much on her own. And when she returned to Orleans, she overdosed on pills in what was considered to be either a suicide attempt or a cry for help. Fortunately, she recovered and she went to the police station near her home and applied for a handgun license. She explained that she needed protection since her husband was about to assume a government ministerial position. She obtained the permit and went to the gun shop, asking the owner to show her a pistol that can kill with one shot. The owner recommended a MAB 7.65, a French-made semi-automatic with a 9-round magazine. She returned the next day, bought the MAB and 25 rounds of ammunition. On August 11, 1951, Pierre was sworn into his ministry post in Paris. The next day, he had an appointment for his first public appearance at the county fair not far from Orleans. When going to the fair, he instructed his chauffeur to stop at his house so he could change his clothes. He entered his house, spoke to his children, and went up to his dressing room to change for his public appearance. Yvonne decided this was a good chance to make one last-ditch effort to save their marriage. She threatened Pierre, saying she would send the boys to boarding school and deny him visits. Then she pleaded, saying she could not possibly love another man and that it broke her heart to see him in the arms of another woman. She said she could change, and she would work hard to make herself a more socially acceptable wife. Finally, as Pierre was changing, Yvonne fell on her knees, begging him to love her. Pierre's dismissal was brutal. He explained to his wife that he no longer wished to have anything else to do with her and that after consideration, despite being a minister, he wanted to divorce her and marry his mistress. Yvonne left the room emotionally stressed and very angry with the way he had treated her. She got the gun from the linen closet where she had hidden it and returned to Pierre's dressing room. She turned the gun on herself and told her husband that she would kill herself if he tried to leave her for another woman. Pierre mocked her, telling her to go ahead and shoot herself, but please wait until he had left the room. Then her emotions took over, and with deadly precision she pointed the gun at Pierre and fired 4 shots, hitting him in the chest, forearm, thigh, and chin. As she stood over him, their oldest child, Matteo, burst into the room and saw his father lying on the floor. Yvonne calmly led him back downstairs and handed him over to the maid. She returned to Pierre's dressing room and shot him a 5th and final time in the back. Minutes later, she called the police station, simply stating, "Please come here at once. My husband needs you urgently." The gendarme arrived and arrested her. Yvonne was accused of murder and confined to jail for more than a year while awaiting trial. The proceedings were moved to Rennes, 150 miles northeast of Orleans, in a failed attempt to reduce the public interest. For months the story was front-page news in France. It was also high-profile in Spanish, Italian, and British newspapers, as well as being reported in the New York Times and featured in the New Yorker magazine. Yvonne had not mentioned the love triangle motive in her first interview with the police, but she later confessed that she had been jealous of her husband's affections for Jean. Initially, most French people were angry that their war hero had been taken from them. Newspapers portrayed Yvonne as a woman who married above her station and who was outmatched culturally and intellectually by her husband. The French public's general opinion was who could blame Pierre for seeking a more sophisticated companion. As time went on, however, the public opinion began to change as details of Pierre's affair and the cold, cruel treatment of his wife began to appear in the press. French journalist Jean Lubaud, a reporter with François, spent time interviewing Yvonne's family and was given access to her letters. Again and again, she swore emotional love to Pierre, even as she revealed her anxiety over his relationship with his lover. As her trial approached, the French wrote about the story every day. Reporters, psychologists, sociologists, criminologists, and other commentators all giving their opinion on the case. Characteristically, in class-conscious France, much was made of her background. She, a peasant's daughter, he, the son of a prominent family. But by now most of France was blaming Pierre for his misbehavior. Yvonne Chevalier went on trial on November 5, 1952. In those days, the French Penal Code included a love triangle provision that absolved from punishment any man who committed homicide after finding his wife in the bed with another man. In this case, the roles were reversed. The Yvonne Chevalier case was widely viewed throughout France as a crime of passion which fell under this provision. At the trial, the defense decided to portray Yvonne as a victim. A woman who fell in love and married a man, bore him 2 children, and then was discarded as he climbed the political ladder. The prosecution case was simple. Yvonne shot her unarmed husband 5 times, a cold-blooded, unprovoked killing. Yvonne arrived in court dressed in a gray suit. Jail had been hard on her. She was thin and pale, which evoked even more sympathy from the spectators, reporters, and the judge, whose name was Raymond Jardin. The judge was very interested in Yvonne. He wanted to know about her marriage and what she had or hadn't said to her husband's lover when she confronted her. The judge asked her a series of questions about her marriage. Yvonne began to sob as she described her relationship with her husband's family. They regarded me as a mistake of Pierre's youth, she said. Judge Jardin questioned Yvonne closely about the hostile meeting she had with Jean after the affair came to light. The judge asked if she told her husband's lover that she was going to kill Pierre. No, Yvonne replied. The judge asked her for her reaction when Pierre coldly informed her that she would divorce her so he could marry Jean, who was sitting in the courtroom. Yvonne started to answer, but she fainted. After a 15-minute recess, the judge asked Yvonne to explain the circumstances of the 5th shot. She replied that she had intended to return to her bedroom to commit suicide beside the love of her life. She explained that the gun fired accidentally, hitting her husband on the back. The next witness was Lion Perrault, the very wealthy husband of Pierre's lover. He testified, but he liked Pierre and that he knew of the affair and deemed a war hero very worthy of his wife's affections. The next witness was Pierre's lover, Jean Perrault, and she approached the witness stand like she was walking onto a movie set. She was 34, glamorous and cool, despite frequent jeers from the gallery. In her response to questions, she said the affair had begun in May 1950, and it continued to the day of the killing 15 months later. She said beloveds rendezvoused in Paris 2 or 3 times a week. When asked whether she was ashamed of her affair, as she was, after all, the mother of 3 young children, she replied, not at all. She said she felt pity for Yvonne, but that she felt deep affection for Pierre and did not plan to end the affair, even after she was confronted by her lover's wife. After Jean testified, the trial continued with different witnesses. The prosecution called relatives of Pierre, who said that Yvonne was a virtual recluse and refused to attend Pierre's family functions and was suspicious of any female who spoke to her husband. A policeman testified that Yvonne had given a series of differing accounts on the fatal events in the bedroom. The last witness was a psychiatrist who revealed that the Chevaliers had a sexless marriage for years, which caused her physical depression. He also said Yvonne suffered from social, physical, and intellectual inferiority complexes. The psychiatrist said that Yvonne had retained the mentality of a teenager in love with a student. At the end of the trial, it seemed the judge and even the prosecution were feeling very sympathetic towards Yvonne. Judge Jardin even swerved French judicial protocol because instead of referring to Yvonne as the accused, he referred to her as Madame. He did, however, in his summing up state, Yvonne had no right to take the life of another person and she should have controlled her jealousy. While the judge summed up, Yvonne began to cry and she repeatedly said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. As the jurors retired to begin deliberations, a big crowd gathered outside the Reims Palace of Justice located on the city square. Jurors watched from a window as the crowd grew to thousands in just 30 minutes. The crowd started to chant, "Free her, free her." The jury deliberated for only 45 minutes and returned with the verdict, not guilty. The crowd outside were euphoric. After the trial and subsequent media frenzy, Yvonne rejoined her sons at her family's farm. The Catholic Church then granted Yvonne absolution for the murder. She tried to resume a normal life, but her reputation as part of France's most notorious crime of passion would not allow it. Even though she had been absolved of the crime by the Church, Yvonne could not rid herself of the overwhelming guilt she felt. So she devised her own form of penance by moving to French New Guinea with her sons, where she worked as a volunteer nurse in a hospital for the poor until her death. Today we are going to Colombia to look at the absolutely shocking crimes of Pedro Alonso Lopez. His childhood was hard. He was born on October 8, 1948 in Tulima, Colombia, which at the time was politically unstable and had the highest crime rate in the world. He was the seventh of 13 children born to a Colombian prostitute. His father, Medardo Reyes, was a member of the country's right-wing political party and was killed in the armed conflict but destabilized the country. Pedro's mother Belinda was 3 months pregnant with Pedro at the time of his father's death. When Pedro was 8, his mother caught him touching his sister, so threw him out of the house. Other accounts, however, say that he ran away of his own accord. So 8-year-old Pedro was living in the Colombian streets. One day he was offered food and shelter by a sympathetic Colombian. But the 8-year-old was taken to an abandoned building and repeatedly sexually assaulted before being put back on the streets. It is thought that this attack had a major influence on Pedro's later life of crime. After being assaulted in Tulima by the pedophile, Pedro became very aware of strangers. He stayed out of sight during the day and looked for food at night. Traveled to the Colombian capital, Bogotá. In Bogotá, he was helped by an American couple who took him to their home and enrolled him in a school for orphans. But when he was 12, a male teacher molested him. Pedro then went back to his life on the Bogotá streets. As Pedro got older, he graduated from small crimes such as stealing food, larger crimes such as stealing cars and selling them to chop shops. Now chop shops are places that would break up the car and sell on the parts. At the time it brought in a good income for Pedro, but at 18 he was arrested and sent to prison for car theft. In prison he was set upon by 4 inmates and gang raped. This made him so upset and angry that it was allegedly consuming him. He then killed 3 of the 4 men responsible. The Colombian authorities added a mere 2 years to his sentence as they judged his actions to be self-defense. During his time in prison, he thought a lot about his life and childhood and developed a rage towards his mother who had put him out on the streets. He was also fascinated with pornographic magazines. His demented hatred of women. Pedro was released from prison in 1978 and moved to Peru, where he began kidnapping and killing young Peruvian girls. These girls were usually of indigenous background and with limited economic means. He was eventually caught by a group of Indians who tortured him and buried him up to his neck in sand. Fortunately for Pedro, an American missionary was passing and persuaded them to release him to the Peruvian authorities, which they reluctantly agreed to do. The Peruvian police, however, did not want to get involved with what they considered to be a trivial local complaint, so deported him to Colombia without truly considering the crimes inflicted upon Peruvian citizens and the danger he posed to society. The near-death experience did nothing to stop his murderous ways, and his killing of young girls continued. It is built on the banks of the Ambata River in a valley surrounded by mountains. And in 1980, the people were celebrating the Festival of Fruits and Flowers, which is one of the most important festivals in Ecuador. However, their celebrations were muted as girls between the ages of 8 and 12 had gone missing. The increase of missing girls was noticed by authorities, but it was concluded that they had probably been kidnapped by child peddlers or sold as sex slaves or had just run away as they had not been doing so well at school. That year in Ambata there was unseasonal high rainfall which resulted in a flood, and this exposed the bodies of 4 murdered children. Only now did Ecuadorian authorities realize there was a serial killer at large. The police didn't have many resources or leads in order to catch the killer. They would even need the public to be vigilant or have luck on their side. A few days later they got their breakthrough at the Plaza Rosa marketplace in Ambata. Kavina Povera saw a man leaving the plaza with her 12-year-old daughter Maria. She shouted loudly at the man, who it was later discovered to be Pedro, and he was captured by the townspeople. He was taken to the police station, and soon the police realized that they had a madman in their custody. Pedro, however, refused to answer any questions, so they decided to enlist for help of a local priest. They dressed him as a prisoner and placed him in a cell with Pedro. The priest soon got Pedro talking, and he soon shared his brutal crimes with his new cellmate. When Pedro was confronted by the police about the crimes he shared with his cellmate, he broke down and confessed. His memory of his crimes was very clear, which was remarkable since he confessed to killing at least 110 children in Ecuador, over 100 more in Colombia, and another 100 in Peru. Pedro admitted that he would walk the streets looking for innocent good girls and I like the girls in Ecuador, he told police. They are more gentle and trusting, more innocent. They are not as suspicious of strangers as Colombian girls. They never scream. They expect nothing. They are innocent, he said. Pedro usually prepared graves in advance, sometimes filled with the dead bodies of other girls he had killed. In the course of his confession, Pedro declared that he had lost his innocence at age 8, so he had decided to do the same to as many young girls as he could. He would walk around markets, in villages, looking for selected targets with a certain look of innocence. Pedro first raped his victims, then stared into their eyes as he strangled them, deriving sadistic pleasure from watching them die. He hunted his victims by daylight, then he would always calm his victims with soft, reassuring words throughout the night. Then at sunrise he would rape and strangle them, satisfying his sexual needs as he watched their eyes fade as they died. He never killed at night because he could not see the victim's eyes and he felt without that element the murder was a waste. In Pedro's confession he told of having tea parties and playing morbid games with the dead children. He would prop them up in their graves and talk to them, convincing himself that his little friends liked the company. But when the dead children failed to answer, he would become bored and go off to find another victim. Police were initially skeptical of their suspect's gruesome claims, but doubts evaporated after Pedro led detectives to 53 graves in the vicinity of Ambata. He stood by in irons as the police unearthed the remains of girls aged 8 to 12. At 28 other sites, searches came up empty. This was probably due to the bodies being taken by predatory animals, but the police were now convinced of Pedro's guilt. The public renamed Pedro the Monster of the Andes. The trial started on the 31st of July, 1981. Pedro was now 33 years old and he pleaded guilty to the murder of 57 girls and was imprisoned in Ambata, where he was officially diagnosed as a sociopath. Because of Ecuador's laws, he received the maximum jail sentence, which at the time was 16 years. Ecuador would later change its maximum prison sentence to 25 years. So this meant for one child's life, Pedro served 1 month in prison. However, no one was concerned that Pedro would have the opportunity to kill again. If paroled from prison in Ecuador, he would still have to stand trial for his murders in Colombia and Peru. Pedro never showed remorse for his crimes. In a prison interview with a journalist, he said that if he got out of prison, he would happily return to killing young children. The pleasure he received from his demented acts of murder overpowered any sense of right from wrong. And he admittedly looked forward to the opportunity to wrap his hands around the throat of his next victim. After 14 years in prison in Ecuador, Pedro was released. He was released 2 years early for good behavior and deported to Colombia, his homeland, where authorities attempted to convict him for a 2-decade-old murder. But instead he was declared insane and in 1995 institutionalized in a psychiatric facility. 3 years later, in February 1998, he was declared sane and released under a $50 bail, with 1 or 2 other additional stipulations. He then went and visited his elderly mother and asked for his inheritance. He was informed that she was living in poverty, so he sold her sofa, bed, and chair to people on the streets, and he vanished. Pedro has not been seen again. Whatever happened to the monster of the Andes is unknown. Many believe that one of the many bounties offered for his death eventually paid off. There is, however, no proof that he has died. Alonso Lopez was responsible for the murders of over 350 children. Yet, in 1998, he was set free despite his vows to kill again.